Hey, I'm Zannerman and this is Wyrmstooth. Wyrmstooth is a mod for the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. It was first released on the Nexus in 2012 and was developed by the user John X0R or Jonxor. The current version for Skyrim SE as of this recording is 1.2.2. The mod takes place primarily on the island of Wyrmstooth in the Sea of Ghosts. It tells the story of an East Empire mining town and its trouble with a recently awoken dragon wreaking havoc. As the Dragonborn, you're hired by the East Empire Company as a foremost expert on dragon hunting to lead a band of mercenaries to deal with the dragon. Wyrmstooth is a large new lands mod, and it really feels like it could have been an expansion to Skyrim in terms of looks, themes, quality, and size. It fits neatly into the mold of vanilla Skyrim. The mod includes a sizable landmass, new dungeons, quests, followers and items and spells, and most of that is made with existing assets. There isn't a lot of deviation from the Skyrim environments and aesthetics, but it manages to have a lot of variation despite that. Being an old mod, and one that is a staple in the modding community, it has a lot of integration with other mods. Patches have been made for many of the mods you might have on your load order, and that's a pretty big strength, and it makes it easier to integrate into large mod lists. I think the mod does some things really well. When playing through the mod, it evoked a feeling in me of being a part of an adventuring group, delving through a long dungeon crawl. Now, that is of course only my subjective experience, but I appreciate the mod for being able to give me that experience when I think it's pretty tricky to pull off in design. While there is a focus on following the quest line, that is only one part of the mod. I would argue that the larger part is what follows after the questline is completed. You have the whole island to explore and side quests to undertake. The island is quite large, with a fair amount of dungeons and enemies to fight, and secrets to find. But going from having a narrative to follow to freeform exploration can be a jarring switch. In this video, I'm going to spoil much of the story beats while discussing it. If you have any intention of playing it, or have any interest in playing it, I suggest you play it for yourself. It's a couple of hours of gameplay, and being a mod, it is free. If you're looking for something that is Skyrim, but more, or just a long dungeon crawl, it's worth playing. Now, with that out of the way, let's continue. Darth Vader is Luke's father. I mentioned this earlier, but the main quest of Wyrmstooth is essentially a dragon hunt. After the vanilla main quest, Way of the Voice, the Imperial Theoden Bien tracks you down. I believe the starting requirements can be modified through an MCM menu. However, you will be considered a Dragonborn throughout the mod, so After the Way of the Voice fits well. Theoden works for the East Empire Company and is looking for mercenaries. He asks you to find Lurius Lior in the Bannered Mare in Whiterun, which kicks off the main questline of Wyrmstooth. Lurius Lior tells you of the East Empire Company's plight. A dragon has been raiding shipments, and you're hired to track it down and kill it. But you're not alone. There are 4 other mercenaries that have been hired. You're sent to meet up with them on the road between Helgen and Falkreath. There are some jarring switches in the audio of the dialogue during this conversation, but I don't recall that being an issue later on in the mod.
A crime against the Thane, from what I hear. I had to pull a few strings with Jarl Elisif to have her released to us.
When you get there, speak to Aether. If he's done his job, then he should know by now where that dragon has been roosting.
Possibly due to some dialogue that was re-recorded or added later. As you travel towards Falkreath, you meet the mercenaries. These mercenaries will accompany you for most of the main quest, and can become followers after you finish Wyrmstooth. So, who are they? Aether is like a natural leader of the group, a Redguard and a former Alikir, who seems to be fairly well put together, when compared to the other 3 at least. Elmera is a psychopathic Altmer mage who was once part of the College of Whispers. Danelit is a wood elf from Valenwood who fought against the Thalmor. And lastly, there's Shagram, an orc who's all about killing. That's his personality, to kill things. Did I mention he kills things? Anyway, he kills things. And he's an orc. An orc who kills things. Anyway, whatever. Together with this band of adventurers, you fight your way up to Ancient's Ascent. There you find the dragon Volturkra and get knocked down. The dragon tells you to follow it to a place called Wyrmstooth and then flies off. Aether and the rest of the mercenaries return to the Bannered Mare to report back to Lurius. Lurius naturally knows of Wyrmstooth, an island in the Sea of Ghosts. The East Empire Company has a mining operation on the island. Ah yes, the island of Wyrmstooth. It would be a shame if there were worms on the island. To get to the island, you have to take a boat from the Solitude docks. When you arrive at Wyrmstooth, the mod designs the narrative to be a mad dash to the end of the main quest. Lurius gives you a speech on the boat, and then you, the mercenaries and Lurius make your way towards the village. Along the way, you fight your way through an imperial fort that is occupied by marauders. You find the village having been attacked by the dragon and mostly destroyed. Elmera stays behind to tend to the wounded. The rest of you travel across the island towards the barrow. Lurius talks along the way, but if you stray too far from him, you can miss the dialogue completely. When you enter the region in the center of the island, you also get attacked by two named dragons, Nehkraket and Nefrinketh. These things just kind of happen one after the other. That does bring me to one place I find the mod lacking. The appearance of the dragons felt random. It wasn't really established before you encounter them that they exist, or much less what their relation to Volturkra is. They just sort of exist. You do find their barrows near where you fight them, so they are similar to other named dragons that appear from the various dragon burial mounds in Skyrim, but the lack of established lore or reasoning for their existence make them feel random. And that's not just these dragons. The marauders I mentioned, who had taken over the Imperial Fort, also felt out of nowhere, because they aren't established before you encounter them in any way. Suddenly, there are these people, marauders, that are hostile. And you go, who are these people? Why did they attack an Imperial Fort and kill all the legionnaires? Are they just opportunists taking advantage of the dragon's rampage? Well, you can make up your own headcanon for things, and some more lore surrounding the marauders is added later on, but I miss having them established beforehand. Having Lurius mention that the marauders are taking advantage of the chaos, or some similar dialogue, would go a long way to making these enemies you come across feel relevant to what you are doing. Anyway, you continue to the barrow and find marauders encamped at the ancient Nordic ruins. You kill them and find your path blocked by a shut gate. The marauders had stolen the sword that acts as a key. The mod is doing sword keys before they were cool, and stashed it with their other loot in a shipwreck along the coast. So you need to go get the sword. The stash itself is undefended, but when you collect the sword, you get attacked by a group of returning marauders. With the sword in hand, you can return to the barrow and open the way forward. The path forward leads to the research laboratory of a mage by the name of Alberthor. He is researching a spell to control Draugr, and you need to use the spell to open the path forward. You take control of Draugr on the other side and are tasked to find the lever that opens the portcullis. While controlling the Draugr, you can actually kill the other Draugrs you come across, but as you control the regular Draugr, you are fairly weak, so it might take a long time before you kill them. Once you open the path, you continue through the barrow together with the mercenaries. The barrow itself is a very long dungeon crawl. Later, you'll find the barrow has several entrances and exits along the way, allowing you to escape the dungeon at regular intervals and have easier points to return to. That also explains why and how you'll find marauders and adventurers as you delve further down. While I like this design in theory, I'm not sure I like the exact way it's implemented in this mod. And let me try to explain why. First off, you are kind of in a narrative time pressure. You are hunting the dragon, which has already burnt down the town and might cause even more harm if left to its own devices. You're accompanied by mercenaries who are coded to follow you while you fight through the dungeon, and will follow you even if you leave. The only town on the island is also burnt down by the dragon, so there's actually nowhere for you to retreat to sell your loot and rest up and recover and buy additional supplies on the island. You would have to return all the way to Skyrim, shattering the narrative flow entirely. And yes, there is another merchant on Wyrmstooth that you can find that isn't in town, but you have to go out of your way to find it. And perhaps Alberthor's lab is supposed to be a home base of sorts during this quest, but it doesn't really have a merchant. These reasons disincentivize you from leaving the dungeon midway through, despite there being so many points where you can leave along the way. Because of that, it also kind of becomes a slog by the end. I cleared everything up until the point you get to Dim Hollow, a sort of Underdark, comparable to Blackreach, filled with Charis, Falmer, and old Dwemer ruins. By the time I reached it, I was already feeling the fatigue, and only plowed through the essential path, not exploring much of anything off the path. To the mod's credit, it does provide you with several lifts for easy access to this area later, so you can come back and explore after the main quest is done, for instance. And there is a lot to find down there. But even now, when thinking of this section, I become fatigued and don't really want to do a return trip. But I did go back and explore many of the side paths. Before you reach Dim Hollow, however, you reunite with Elmera, who apparently entered the barrow through an opening in the cavern roof. After you reunite with Elmera, you fight a Draugr boss by the name of Silaik. After the boss fight, Alberthor catches up with the party. The path forward is to drop down into a pit leading down into Dim Hollow. Down in Dim Hollow, Alberthor from above inhabits a Falmer corpse and joins your party. You find some fallen adventurers down here, some of whom hold journals. There are many scattered journals around Wyrmstooth, and I do recommend reading them. Some of them are pretty funny, like Vork's journal, and not overly long. After slogging your way through Dim Hollow, you once again come face to face with Volthur Kra, this time in a large cavern filled with corpses of fallen adventurers. These are the adventurers who made it too far exploring the barrow. The dragon has lured you into a trap of his own devising. The dragon flees, but not before resurrecting this army of the dead, and forcing you to fight them to survive in a gauntlet. When you return to the surface, a contingent of Imperial guards has arrived. You see their carriages, transporting legionnaires on their way to deal with the dragon. You rush back to the village, where the final showdown with Volthur Kra takes place. After the dragon is slain, you speak with Lurius for your reward. The village will begin rebuilding efforts, and he tells you that you should return after several days' time. And that essentially ends the main quest of Wyrmstooth. Now, you could go and explore the rest of the island at this point. However, you could also hold off on that until the village is rebuilt. Because after it is, you get a lot of quests that take you to various parts of the island, and you might be laden down with a lot of loot, with nowhere to sell it, and with no bed for you to sleep in either, if you run a needs mod. So with the story done, that leaves us with the exploration part, and well, everything else the mod has to offer. I think it takes around a week for the village to rebuild, and when it does, the village features an inn to sleep in, a blacksmith, and a Khajiit merchant, as well as a notice board where you can get quests. The notice board will be the main source of direction towards quests on the island. Each of the 4 mercenaries also has a side quest that they ask of you, and you need to complete their quest before you can recruit them as a follower. Shagram wants you to kill Ulfgar at the Silver Blood Inn in Markarth. Danelit wants you to steal a necklace from Eriker's inventory in Solitude, which is only possible through pickpocketing, as I believe he is marked as essential. Aether wants you to retrieve a sword from the Forsworn at Hag's End, and Elmera wants you to bring her spittle sticks. Now these quests take you back to Skyrim, save for Elmera's spittle sticks, which you can actually find growing on Wyrmstooth, so they work as a good pastime as you wait for the village to rebuild. The mod also has a big player home called Fort Valus that you can purchase from Lurius Lior after completing the Wyrmstooth questline. It's a neat money sink with a lot of upgrades to different sections of the fort. You can also get some people to populate the fort as you purchase upgrades to it. And once you complete the Golden Pantaloon quest, you can find Jalrun here. The fort isn't just a player home. It also has some quest relevance to one of the side quests, which is a nice touch. There is a lot to do around Wyrmstooth, with quite a few dungeons to explore and quests to complete. But post-Dragon, it all feels a bit aimless. The quests and dungeons aren't tied together or relate to each other much at all, with the exception of a few dungeons that tie into Vulom's quest or the Golden Pantaloon quest. There is also only one quest that really ties into rebuilding the mining operation, where you're tasked to clear out an ebony mine. Most of the quests are really just tasks from the noseboard, and while they are unique, some lack interactions with NPCs along the way. The walkthrough calls these bounty quests. I do think the dungeons themselves are good. Each has an interesting idea behind it, and they look great, on par with regular Skyrim if not better. A lot of it is ice caves though. Given the region that the mod takes place in, I suppose it's warranted, but it can feel a bit samey. Some of them really give off a feeling of delving through forgotten spaces and ancient civilizations, with vast open caverns and half-buried structures. And that is kind of what I want out of a dungeon. The exploration is pretty smooth, and there are some neat details in the environment. Heh, neato. The mod has a lot of references to Morrowind, from giant mushrooms dotted around and other strange vegetation. There's also callbacks to the Mudcrab Merchant, for instance, or the quest involving a Nord being paralyzed and having his pants stolen. Another Morrowind classic. It is clear that the author is a fan of RPGs, and while I'm sure there are references I missed, I could spot a few from other series too, like finding a dead prisoner named Minsk, or the bonfire with a sword stuck into it. In the dungeons there are sometimes optional bosses. The bosses are vastly more difficult than the rest of the dungeon they are found in. For instance, there is a Wisp Mother boss in a dungeon that is otherwise a vampire den, and when you trigger the boss, you get locked into the room, and are forced to fight the Wisp Mother, Veldrin, and a dozen copies of her. There is also a Marauder boss in Cragwater, with one of the most bullshit weapons ever, that ragdolls you across the room when you get hit. If you get hit by it, you're basically stun-locked until you die, no matter how much healing items you can pump into yourself. There are also some unmarked quests. There's one that leads you around the island on a treasure hunt, looking for clues, and ultimately unlocks a Marauder treasure stash. Among the rewards you can find on the island, there are some new spells that expand on vanilla spells, or areas that vanilla spells are lacking in, like Cure Disease or Poison, and the summon spells for various Draugr. There are also some magic items that you can find, and a new shout to unlock. There are some locations whose purpose is not immediately obvious to me. I'm still not sure what the purpose of the Orcish stronghold existing on Wyrmstooth is, because as far as I explored, it didn't have a quest associated with it, or an importance to the narrative. Chillwater Mill also seems to just exist to add to the world building or immersion, and I think that's fine. I feel like I come across as too negative at times, and I don't want that to be the takeaway. I wouldn't be making videos about mods I think are terrible, or just mediocre. I'd love to be able to inject some positivity into people's lives, and I think you can always mine stuff for inspiration in the materials that you consume. You just gotta have the right perspective. I games master for tabletop role-playing games, and sometimes I even write like some sort of a wannabe author or something. I can always find some nice inspiration for my campaigns, my worlds, or my stories in the stuff I play and watch. I'll know if something doesn't work for me if there's nothing in the story I find interesting. And that's why I'd like to highlight some of the things from the mod that I find evocative. Like, I really like the idea of the barrow, this massive underground dungeon filled with treasure and danger, and several entrances and exits to different parts of the dungeon, with a history of various adventuring parties that have delved in and tested their mettle against the dungeon's inhabitants, and some come out with treasure. And the idea that the adventuring parties that make it too deep discover a terrible secret the dragon in its depths, and that they end up as fodder for its growing undead army. Despite my qualms on the specifics of how it was implemented in the mod, there's something I really like about that idea, that gets the creative juices flowing, as some would say. The barrow is in a similar vein to Undermountain in the Forgotten Realms, for instance, or the endless paths of Odd Nua from Pillars of Eternity, so not an idea I haven't come across previously, but by no means any less cool. Another dungeon I found really cool was the End of Krakavisa, with a full town inside a cavern. There's something cool about that aesthetic. Every time I see the idea used, I love it, much like the fort in Beyond Skyrim Bruma. The mod also uses a mechanic that I haven't seen used in many other quest mods. I'm talking of the mechanic where you inhabit the body of the Draugr for a while. I know that the mod Proteus has a similar mechanic that allows you to take control of any NPC. I'm sure there are plenty of limitations that aren't made obvious from just the example in Wyrmstooth. In Wyrmstooth, you're inhabiting a humanoid creature of roughly the same stature, and with no enemies that fight back, so handling death is not a concern. But I would be interested to see if the same mechanic could be applied to, for example, inhabiting a skeever and moving through spaces that would otherwise be inaccessible for a humanoid, as a puzzle of sorts. I found that a really interesting mechanic, and certainly one I'd be interested in seeing expanded upon or attempted again by future mods.
Conclude. I'm gonna fucking conclude.
I mentioned in the introduction that this mod is Skyrim, but more. That doesn't mean that the experiences it provides aren't unique. Sure, it isn't as expansive as the likes of Beyond Reach or Vigilant, and doesn't have the amount of unique assets that those mods have, but that can also be one of its strengths. It fits into an expanded vanilla experience more seamlessly. The story is fairly straightforward and simple in concept, so don't go in and expect a narrative masterpiece. Despite that, I like it better than the majority of Bethesda's own writing. I like the reveal of the undead army at the end of Dim Hollow, and that is a cool set-piece encounter. The final fight against Volturkra was not as good in my opinion, as it took place almost entirely in an open field, and was fairly standard fare for a dragon fight in Skyrim. The build-up was done fairly well, but the fight itself fell a bit short in terms of gameplay and set-piece spectacle. Now, I didn't go over everything that the mod includes in this video. The video is long enough despite that, so if you play it for yourself, you'll still find plenty of things I didn't even mention. There's a very in-depth walkthrough for the mod that is available on the mod's Nexus page. It adds some context to locations you find throughout Wyrmstooth with a nice blurb, and provides a guide to the spells, quests, and shouts you can find in the mod. I didn't use the walkthrough until writing the script for this video, and I do feel like I missed out by not having the short blurbs and descriptions for the various locations I explored. I think those would have added to my enjoyment of the mod itself. When playing through Wyrmstooth, I didn't use any add-ons, save for Modpocalypse NPCs for Wyrmstooth. I could probably have done a better job at patching it into my load order, but I didn't encounter any crashes or many bugs. There was one instance of Volturkra during the build-up to the final fight, where he was unresponsive for a time. But I do consider it a very stable mod. Anyway, that's all I had to say for this mod. Thanks for watching.